But just in case people are lost, I won't start the presentation just yet, but any further thoughts on this very interesting chapter? I mean, some very interesting posts in the forum. I mean, there's a lot of questions there, and I just couldn't choose between them which sort of line to follow. But I think there's so much in this chapter, including not just the notion of kind of method versus post method, but the notion of critical pedagogy, the political and ideological component of methods, but also of teaching generally, and also the local practices that are mentioned, and how these, in a sense, circumvent or supersede or whatever the notion of method or local methods, if you like. There's an awful lot there that we could talk about. But is anything you're burning to share at this point before I take over, and then we go into groups?
I actually have one question. Um, when I was reading this, I questioned the existence of these AI or ChatGPT or Duolingo. So based on that, I feel like all these platforms that nowadays are fashionable or Instagram is trying to bring more into teaching, I believe that they are kind of forcing us to move to the first part. I think it was behaviorism ideology. So at that point, they're also shaping how we are going to teach in the future and what is correct or not correct. And
Mm-hmm.
also, they're trying to avoid that dogme method, basically, or learning the natural way of English.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that was
Go
the
on, Sally.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very interesting one. And in fact, I mean, in a sense, it's not new that technologies have kind of impacted or influenced or directed the course of teaching. When you go back to things like the language laboratory, for example, I mean, once you've invested in a technology like that in your university or your school or whatever, you feel compelled to use it. And it was the same with, the advent of technologies like interactive whiteboards, etc. Not cheap, and they have an impact on what teachers do in the classroom, whether they choose to ignore them or not. But similarly, with the mass marketing of apps, language learning apps like Duolingo, and I want to come back to that a bit later on, actually. The Yes, that certainly influences the way people think about language learning, or it confirms a lot of their sort of views of language learning, that it is a kind of, a fairly mechanical and somewhat mindless activity. If we look at, I mean, I haven't looked at Duolingo for a while, but it's very popular. Why? Because A, it's free, and B, it has a gaming element built in. And everybody has access to it if they have a phone. So, I mean, yeah, that. And now the question, of course, coming back to your question, Sabra, is whether we ignore these technologies, but we do so at our peril because students are going to be using them, whether we integrate them somehow and take them into account. But Kat has just posted in the chat a link I just see to, yeah, the way that certain technologies de-skill teachers, and not just Duolingo. Naomi, yes, that's fine. So yeah, a very good question. And perhaps it's not one that's really dealt with in this book, the whole impact of technology on methods and methodology. But it's always one we need to keep present. And particularly now with artificial intelligence. And I just posted a note for Hugh in his forum post in response, saying that no artificial intelligence could replace Hugh Nicol as a teacher because he is so adaptive and versatile and experienced. So this is our great strength, the ability to meet, to adapt to the needs of our particular students in our particular context. Now, of course, AI can help us do that to a certain extent, but and certainly in terms of preparation of designing texts, etc., and even lesson plans, and also for learn and practice out of class. Now, I'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, so yeah, good question, Saba. Good one to start us off. Any other points before I launch? I'm just going to start. Yes, just say.
Good morning. This was a very enlightening chapter, really. And the only thing I would like to mention is that I'm retired now, but um, as an English literature teacher at the university for a long time, at least in literature, every time we use the prefix pre or post, in terms of literary movements, it's because we don't know what it is really. I don't mean that when the book uses, the idea of post method, we haven't reached. I mean, at least I haven't read the rest of the book, but that's the feeling I guess, using this theory that we use, because when we talk about pre-modernism or postmodernism, and we still use postmodernism in literature, even though many decades have passed, and so um, I understand that the evolutionary aspect and that was a major takeaway for me, instead of a revolutionary aspect of methods, but evolutionary. And I would like to know what you think of it, because we're still using post method, but do we know what this era really is? And that seems to be the question. And it's, to me, it's even more, I mean, I think it's essential for teachers to know, when we think of teacher training and even in service and pre-service, that we have to be much more aware of this history in order to maybe shape this
Mhm,
post method era
mhm.
more consciously.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, very good point. And I think it's interesting to connect this post idea with other post um, movements, as and postmodernism, for example, the idea that maybe it just represents a vacuum that's or it is the reaction towards the scientific technological way of, or modernist way of thinking. It's interesting, actually, and I responded, I think it was to Count Duc's post about, she was talking about mixing and matching, and I said, yes, there's a French word for that, which is bricolage, which is used by philosophers to talk about postmodernism, the idea that there is no one narrative, that you combine lots of different bits and pieces. But of course, there's a resistance to that by many scholars and writers, that is just a sort of anything goes kind of, you know, anarchic kind of way of thinking. And I want to come back to that point shortly. But James, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to share with Jose's so discomfort, if I might say, about this prefix post, because it gives us an idea that, that say post method, that methods are done, or postmodernism, that modernism's done, but it's not the case, of course. Those old things continue along at the same time. And what was interesting is that Kumarava Divalu's, if I get that, Kumarava Divalu's book was called The Postmodern Conditioner, his first article. And that's a direct play on Francois Lyotard's book, The Post the postmodern condition, okay? And that was all about epistemology, about philosophy of science and how can we know something, and the fact that there's no monolithic sense of what science is for or how we proceed in achieving knowledge or constructing knowledge anymore. Okay, so and interestingly enough, in all of his writings, he never cites Lyotard, although he actually, stole the title for his book or from his article from him. But there is quite a pedigree there on philosophy of science, with firearms against method, okay, and the structure of scientific revolutions as well. All of those play into this whole idea of post-method. And our book, of course, doesn't go into the whole philosophy of it, but I think the warning is really well taken that anything that's post doesn't mean it's all over. It's still there and going strong, usually.
Good point, James. Thank you for bringing those threads together. Yes. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said here, particularly about, I'm just looking for somewhere in my bookshelf, I have Jeff Jordan and Mike Long's book about ELT and what's wrong with it. And he takes a very anti-post kind of view, a non-kind of relativist position, because of both of them, their kind of scientific outlook, etc. And there's a resistance to this idea that anything goes. And I think this is something we need to address, really. So let's just let me just share a couple of slides here before I put you into a kind of task that I have up my sleeve. One thing that's come up again and again in the conversations, both here in the room and also on the forum, is the notion of, people feeling more comfortable describing themselves as being principled eclecticists rather than adhering to any single method. And so this is the notion that comes through in this chapter that we have just read, but also in other books on methods, including my own. And here I contrast this notion of sort of anything goes, this random approach to teaching, as opposed to a principled approach. So forgive the long quote, but I say there's a difference between, on the one hand, simply stringing a sequence of borrowed techniques together in a somewhat random fashion. That would be the sort of bricolage, mix and match, smorgasbord kind of thing. And on the other, choosing those techniques which are consistent with a coherent theory of language learning. And that's the difference, in short, between eclecticism and principled eclecticism. Now, I didn't invent that distinction. I mean, Diane Larson Freeman and many other people before, and going way back to Henry Sweet at the end of the 19th century, saying that good teachers are eclectic. So I say it's not the case then that anything goes. It's not random. At the very least, the principal teacher should be able to respond to the question, why did you do that, with an answer that is grounded in some understanding of language learning, and of the language learning context. That's the principles. But I mean, I'm not sure if that's 100% satisfying, or satisfying, say, to a new teacher to say, okay, can you answer the question, why did you do that? And a lot of the things we do in the class, I wonder if it is that easy to say, if somebody is watching one of our lessons and sort of said at any one point, well, why did you do that? How easy is it to articulate the principles behind what we do? Are we that principled in a kind of conscious fashion? And the whole notion of principles, of course, is like, well, which principles, whose principles? And it always reminds me of Groucho Marx's famous, among his many famous utterances, those are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others. And this is how we might answer somebody who says, well, I don't agree with your principles, your approach to teaching. So, okay, fine, give me another set of principles and I'll adopt those. So why I'm interested in the post-method thing is that particularly Kumarama Divalu's take on it, is that it does seem to be principled, and it presents us with a set of principles, which all admittedly, the original article as and the one that's in the file in the Dropbox file came out in 1994, so it's quite a way back now. One could argue that these principles that he outlines, these macro strategies, have kind of reached their sell-by date, or they need to be updated, which is partly what Penny argues in that little extract at the end of the chapter. But just to quickly summarize what he was saying, basically he was challenging the idea of methods, that methods are based on an idealized concepts. It was idealized context. So they don't necessarily fit all contexts. That's a given. Yeah, he wasn't the first to say that. He was the first to use the term post-method, as far as I can tell. And it's interesting, James, yes, that he doesn't attribute the use of post-method condition to Leotard, for example. Post-methods pedagogy allows us to go beyond and overcome the limitations of a method base. That's his thesis. I visualize post-method pedagogy as a three-dimensional system, and so this is how he has his 3 Ps, consisting of pedagogic parameters of particularity, practicality, and possibility. And he visualizes them in the book like that. They're kind of interlocking parameters, and the definitions of those are in Graham's chapter. What he means by a pedagogy of particularity, one that's particular to particular context, a pedagogy of possibility. So there's that transformative element about it, perhaps the critical consciousness, if you like, and practicality. And you might also add, substitute practicality, plausibility as well. So is it, for the teacher, is it practicable? Is it plausible? Is it something that the teacher believes that they could do, would want to do in their classroom, or the students would accept? And then he goes on to present this framework, this strategic framework with these 10 different macro strategies that map onto those 3 Ps, if you like. And he defines macro strategies as general plans derived from theoretical, empirical, and pedagogical knowledge. So in other words, the argument, what he's saying here is these macro strategies, he didn't pull them out of the thin air. They are evidence-based. They're evidence-based, or they were in 1994, and what we knew about language and language learning. A macro strategy is a broad guideline based on what teachers can on which teachers can generate their own situation-specific, needs-based micro-strategies or classroom techniques. So you take these macro strategies, they're not prescriptive, but they offer a framework from which we can measure our approach and say, is it consistent with at least some of these macro strategies? And the macro strategies are these in his article and also in his books. Incidentally, he's a lovely, lovely man. I met him at a conference in Western Australia. And his name must have been pronounced many times at the conference, but I never quite got it. So I'm sure my pronunciation of Kumarama Divalu is not his. But anyway, he's a very, very sweet, unassuming man, and I think, and a very, very good scholar. And he gave some really interesting talks at that particular conference. So we don't have time to go through all these, but I mean, I want to focus though on one of them, and the one I think, which is the one that in a sense subsumes all the others, which is the first one: maximize learning opportunities. And it's almost like a sort of no-brainer. I mean, of course, isn't that what we do? Isn't that what we're trying to do as teachers, and not just as teachers, as teacher trainers, as textbook writers, as material designers, etc. We're trying to maximize learning opportunities. But I think it is interesting the way he phrases that. It's not like, teach better. It's the focus is on learning, and we know that the correlation between teaching and learning is not always a symmetrical one. So my task for you And we could, if we get time later, we could talk about any of these other macro strategies. But my task for you is at the moment, or this is how he portrays all those 12 or 10 macro strategies mapped onto particularity possibility. My task for you is, how do you maximize learning opportunities? So just let's do that. I'll put you into rooms. How many are we? 12. Okay, 4 rooms. And just toss that one around. And if you don't want to talk about that, then or you run out, then address any of the other macro strategies that he suggests. And like, for example, promoting learner autonomy is another interesting one. How do we do that? But let's start with the macro strategies. I mean, with the maximizing learning opportunities. So I'm going to have 4 rooms. Create, open all the rooms. I'll give you 10, 15 minutes on this. And Josette, let's see if you can stay in your room this time. Right. Naomi, sorry, I abandoned you there. I was in a room when you came back.
It's okay. I'm
Nobody
glad I'm
tells
here
you.
now.
Okay, just a quick whip around from the different group things that stood out for you. Anybody want to start the ball rolling? Perhaps somebody who hasn't? Can't. Okay.
Yep. Okay. Kanduk will. I'm not going to share everything that we discussed in our group, but what stuck, what stayed, and that we had that at the end of our conversation was that Jose pointed out that it was harder to identify learning opportunities and learning, whether learning has or has not happened at a level above B1, B2. So we were saying that when when they're beginners or pre-intermediate, they've got they're learning how to spell their name, they're learning how to do numbers, give you their address, whatnot, right? But then when you get towards the higher levels, I kind of summed it up as you have a core repertoire of language that you have, and you're doing other things in class, not at that basic level, but the learners don't see the purpose of that. And I'm just gonna leave it there and just say, maybe do you want to add to it, or Oscar or Sergio? Because I thought that was really, really interesting. That point that was made.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good point. In the end, who's to judge what the learning opportunities were except for the students? And that's maybe where, one of the micro strategies, in fact, I'm just checking here that Kumaramadivulu suggests is having a student response sheet, and he gives an example. This is in the book. Immediately after the lesson, distribute the student response sheet shown for students to complete. Explain the question. So the first question is, what do you think the teacher most wanted you to learn from today's lesson? And so on. And so again, this is something that they can do together. And maybe it's a kind of consciousness raising activity for those who perhaps weren't as observant, to realize that, yes, there were takeaways from the lesson. Of course, that assumes that language learning is about, learning of facts and information, which we need to disabuse learners of that. Also, it's not just about learning new stuff, but it's getting better at the old stuff, automating it, becoming fluent, etc., which is much harder to track. When do you know really that you're more fluent today than you were last week, kind of thing? I mean, you may know some more irregular verbs, some more phrasal verbs, but How do you measure your listening comprehension? So, but nevertheless, I think it pays to ask the learners what they think you were trying to do and what they took away from it. James.
Yeah, we had two kind of threads in our group at the beginning. One was sort of the humanistic side of it, of being learner-centered and getting the group dynamic right and such. And the other side was the more pragmatic, operative side of having a diversity of activity types. And as we talked, we started talking about having really large classes of 70 people, like Fazul's situation, or by Hugh in Japan with his engineering students. And it seems to me, at least, I'm not really talking for the group here, but it seems to me they converge then, that when you have a situation like that, having a diversity of activity types actually makes that possible, makes possible the development of a learner-centeredness if they're willing, if they have the ability to choose what they want to do in that mass auditorium sort of situation. So it's kind of interesting how there was a convergence, at least in my mind, of these different ways to approach things once the context is such that you don't have any more other choices, basically.
That's a very good point. And it's as well to think of, yes, I mean, it's not to underestimate the challenge of teaching 70 students. But nevertheless, if you're teaching one-to-one, what are the learning opportunities that are available in the classroom? They're only there, they're to the power of two, really, the teacher and the learner. But if you increase the number of people in the classroom, you're exponentially increasing, theoretically, the learning opportunities if the class is managed so that students can learn off each other. And this is where maybe they're not learning information off each other, but they are getting better at that ethereal stuff, the skills improvement. If they're doing lots of speaking in the classroom, if they're doing lots of collaborative writing in groups, for example, how much you can learn from doing a collaborative writing exercise in terms of sharing vocabulary, for example, sharing discourse, knowledge of discourse structure, etc. So, but it's a management problem, as I'm sure Fazlul will agree. I mean, how do you keep everybody on task when you've got, you're the one who has to monitor and moderate all this activity, and you can only do it one group at a time. So that seems to me is the challenge. It's a management challenge, but in terms of learning opportunities, there's a massive potential there. Joseph, sorry.
Well, I just want to add or explain why I mentioned that in our group. I think Kanduk summarized it very well, but the book that I shared in the chat is The Principled Communicative Approach. I think maybe all of you are familiar with it. And
Yeah.
the first tenet or principle is the personal significance principle. It means what they say here is that this has been the basic tenet of student-centered communicative language teaching, and we believe that this principle is just as valid now as it was first formulated. And that's why I said that I think it's easier to identify what is what is personally significant, because all of us need numbers, all of us need when you think of notions and functions, there are some of those notions and functions that are common to all of us, at least to most of us. We want to express quantity, we want to express willingness to do something or not. So that's easier at the more basic levels than after maybe B1. But I think there's a pressure on all of us teaching L2 that you don't find when they're learning and they're practicing or learning in school their own language. We seem to have to prove this much more that they're learning than, for example, their L1 teachers, right? Because are they really improving in their mother tongue? Are they really enlarging their vocabulary? Do they really know how to conjugate the verbs or use you know, appropriate grammar in their first language? It seems that in a way we seem to be more self-conscious as L2 teachers than L1 teachers, and there's a lot of pressure on all of us teaching a second language or an additional language. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. This is the book, right? And I'm glad you reminded me of that because, in fact, yes, this is, I mean, he organizes it into, well, they organize it into, not unlike Kumaramadiglu, various principles. So you could say these are the macro strategies, and the first one is the personal significance principle, so which matches Kumaramadiglu's one about making things relevant and socially relevant, but also personally. They have also the controlled practice principle and the declarative input principle. That is to say, giving rules, etc. So I'm not 100% agreement with these principles because I do think they're quite controversial, whether to what extent controlled practice is useful and what kind of controlled practice. But other principles, like the language exposure principle, that is to say, learners should have maximum opportunities for exposure to the language, would seem to be uncontroversial.
What I like
yeah.
about, if I may, what I like about the book is that, of course, first, if they felt the need to write a book about the principled communicative approach, so they felt that the communicative approach had to be sort of revisited and maybe had to have a facelift. But the other thing is that they propose some activities, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
the thing is not only theoretical. So they're sort of trying to use their tenets or principles in a practical way, or suggest some practical activities.
Yes, exactly. It is a very good book. It's worth looking at. Despite I have certain reservations because I do think they're in a rather narrow cognitive sort of declarative knowledge, explicit knowledge kind of syndrome. But no, it's well worth looking at. Let's well, any other from the other groups that we haven't heard of? Have we heard from every group? Hugh, which group were you in? You're off muted, I mean.
Okay, yeah, I was with James, Fazlul, and
Okay.
Elaine.
Okay. And Elaine, where were you? Okay.
I was with the same group. I was with the same group.
Okay, fine. So we've kind of heard from everybody. Listen, I'm going to go back to the presentation. We won't have time to do this in the remaining 7 minutes, but I'll sort of carry on. It's being recorded. I just wanted to pull out a few things from my list of and what I think ways of maximizing learning opportunities, and quickly talk through some of these at least. And you'll be familiar if you've done previous courses with me with some of these ideas. But broaden the curriculum goals, provide space for the learners, relinquish control, scaffold interaction, and teach learners strategies and promote self-directed learning. So very, very quickly, what I mean by broadening the curriculum goals is, rather than traditionally where teaching is directed at often very specific teaching points and typically grammatical ones, this doesn't allow for the sort of diversity that's within every classroom, not just diversity of levels, but diversity of learning dispositions, interests, etc. And Dick Allwright, in this wonderful article, which I'm sure, James, you've probably uploaded, but it's well worth going back to, because he uses the term learning opportunities in the title of this paper. And he says, yes, I see planning as crucial to language teaching and learning, but planning for richness of opportunity, planning for learning opportunities rather than planning for very determined, highly specific learning outcomes, typically grammatical ones or linguistic ones at least. But the broader we stretch our aims, the more chance we have of kind of netting that diversity in the classroom. And Kumaramadivulu says in his book, he says, we may have to get away from the long cherished notion of pedagogical success. That pedagogical success is determined by a combination of well-planned teachers' agenda supported by a well-designed textbook based on a well-conceived syllabus. So he's sort of saying the same thing, that, you know, we actually, however well-planned our agenda is in the syllabus and the course book, it narrows the possibilities. Remember, pedagogy of possibility was one of his 3 Ps, because it's not like a method. Although we haven't used the term here, method, but methods, we've agreed, tend to constrain the possibilities rather than open them up. And similarly with the course book, which for many teachers is the method. Henshaw and Hawkins, in a book that we used on a previous course here, Common Ground, say their answer to that is to give priority to understanding content over understanding rules, content rather than, you know, grammatical rules. Saba said something like that in the conversation I eavesdropped on about you need to immerse learners. What was it, your term, Saba, in the language?
Dive in.
You make them dive into the language. Exactly. I love that. So it's a content rather than specific language rules. They say plan your lessons around communicative goals rather than a list of grammar structures to cover. So again, broadening the kind of, and I use this analogy from curriculum science, educational curricula, not necessarily language curricula. Note the difference between broad and narrow curricula. So a narrow curriculum might be where the lesson is designed on teaching the present simple. Yeah, the learners learn the present simple. Whereas a broad aim would be talk about free time activities, which of course includes the present simple, but lots of other stuff as well. It's something that all students can do, whether or not they're ready for or able to understand the present simple. And this comes from a book which was written for primary school teachers in New Zealand, actually dealing with multiple or very diverse classrooms of students with lots of different mother tongues, etc. Curriculum that promotes only segmented, isolated, and elemental learning tasks, you know, like a teaching points, grammatical syllabus, reduces the student's degree of learning, including incidental learning. And also, he adds their preparedness for future learning. I think the thing about incidental learning is very important. If we want to maximize learning opportunities in the classroom, we need to, as Saba says, dive into the language so that they pick up other stuff that's going on in the classroom in this massive language that's being generated in a class where the focus is on content rather than these very specific objectives. So that would be, yeah, that's my first point about sort of broadening the curriculum. Now, not always easy if you're working with an institution which has a prescribed syllabus, prescribed exams, etc. But even then, just by thinking about, you know, okay, so the course book says learn the present simple, but maybe if I broaden that into thinking about, well, when do we use the present simple communicatively, and what kind of tasks and what kind of genres, etc. So let's just expand that a little bit, and then everybody can contribute. It's more heterogeneous, if you like. By providing space for the learners, I'm taking this expression from Paul Seedhouse and Steve Walsh's chapter in this very good book. If you don't know it, passed unnoticed by me until very recently. This is a fantastic book. We should be, anyway. they're very interested in the interaction that happens in the classroom, not just between the students, but between the teacher and the students, and the possibilities that teacher-student interaction has for creating learning opportunities. But learners need space. They need room. I don't mean physical room, although that helps, but space for to be able to participate, to contribute to class conversations, to get feedback on their contributions from each other, but also from the teacher, of course. So this relates to the next point, which is like providing opportunities for co-construction of language. And this is a quotation we used, I think, in the last session when I was talking about, remember, community language learning, when they're sitting around in groups, recording dialogues, conversations. And Michael Breen says, not about that specific methodology, but he says, the language I learn in the classroom is a communal product derived through a joint constructed process. So, I mean, this goes back to my point about, the bigger the class, the more students there are, the more language there is. So theoretically, if you can manage it, then there's massive opportunities for jointly constructed learning and for learning opportunities. And so that relates to this question of control. The more we try to control the classroom, the more we constrain the learning opportunity. So there's a difficult balance between like chaos on the one hand and strict control on the other, and trying to find that medium point whereby the learners have a fair amount of control of the lesson themselves, the direction of the lesson, the content of the lesson, without it kind of becoming chaotic. But Allwright and Hank say, if teachers are trained to believe that their survival depends on their being in total control of everything, and this goes back to your initial training, how will they ever dare to risk sharing that control? How will they ever find out just how much learners can contribute to lessons? And my story, and I'm not going to bore you with it again because I've told it 10,000 times, but Pata will be able to tell it, about my Time magazine lesson, when in 6 months of teaching, I decided to take a risk and see how much a beginner's group of learners in Egypt could come up with at a single visual prompt. And it was just amazing what they were able to, what that prompt was able to generate just in a class of 16 students. And that was like an eye-opening moment for me. Kumaramadivulu, you can look at these quotes later on. Paul Seedhouse and Steve Walsh again talking about how do you create space? Well, you scaffold interaction through what they call classroom interactional competence. So you let the learners have a degree of control of the lesson, not at every stage of the lesson, but handing over at some point, saying, okay, talk about it, respond to this text that you've just read, for example, or the song that you've just heard, or use this item of language to talk about something that's happened to you. But the teacher is not just, and this came up in the group, or no, maybe Jose, you mentioned this before about, the difference. Student-centered learning doesn't necessarily mean more learning opportunities, but it does if the teacher's there shaping the contributions and scaffolding, paraphrasing, correcting, reiterating, and so on. So this is where the teachers are invaluable. And this is where teachers, no artificial intelligence program can replicate the kind of, at the point of need, scaffolding that experienced teachers can do. Well, we know what students are trying to say, and we know what they're capable of saying. And no AI program in the world has that kind of sensitivity to what individual learners are trying to say using this language, what they're capable of saying, etc. But as experienced teachers and experienced with these particular learners, we're able to do that. We do it instinctively, just as mothers do it with their children, or fathers do. Kumaramadivulu, love this quote. Teachers are seen both as creators of learning opportunities for their learners. So we create learning opportunities by choosing materials, designing the lesson, planning the lesson, etc. But we also utilize the learning opportunities that learners create. But they only create those learning opportunities if we give them the space and the motivation. So it's again a balancing act. And he goes on to say, learners create learning opportunities for themselves and for other learners by seeking clarification. So, sorry, what does that mean? By raising doubts, by making suggestions and so forth. Again, but they need space and they need the language to be able to do that. Expressions, classroom language, process language. Could you repeat that? I don't understand what you said. That sort of thing. Do you mean that, etc. And he's insistent, Kumaramadura, saying we shouldn't ignore learners' doubts and problems, because if one learner's got a doubt or a problem, chances are other learners have got it as well, and they're just not putting their hand up. So, deal with the stuff that comes up. These are, it's like learners' mistakes. They are incredibly useful learning opportunities in their own right. And then finally, my last thing on my list was combination of teaching learning strategies and promoting self-directed learning. That is to say, out-of-class learning, particularly. Because, and Leo Van Leer says, if the lessons, whether they're once a week, once a day, or more frequent than that, are the only occasions on which students are engaged with the language, progress will either not occur or be exceedingly slow. The students' minds must occupy themselves with the language between lessons as much as in lessons. And of course, we're all aware of that. And, traditionally, this is why we set things like homework and that. And because nowadays we have so many more tools learners have, but they need to be shown how to use these tools. So, I mean, some of the ones I'm just listing here, learner-centered source content. It's the content that learners bring back from whatever they've read outside the classroom, whatever they've watched, that feeds back into the classroom. And if this is done on a regular basis, and I've told you the story before about my colleague Neil, every lesson that he teaches, he used to teach, he's retired now, but it always begin with students in groups saying, okay, tell everybody something that you read or heard or saw since the last lesson. And they go into groups, and it's often rather trivial and boring stuff, but occasionally something comes up which captures not just the group's attention, but the teacher's attention. And he'll say, okay, that was a great monster. Can you tell the rest of the class about that documentary you saw on television about dolphins? Learner-sourced content. I mean, this has been around for so long, the idea of extensive reading, now extensive viewing, of course, that we forget about it, but it's just so important. It's been mentioned already in the forum. Vocabulary, I'll show you an example in a minute. I'm sure you're aware of all the kinds of digital tools that are available for students to review vocabulary, like Quizlet. Social networks, WhatsApp groups, I'll give you an example in a second. Project work, participatory research, this is mentioned in the chapter. Journaling, blogging, podcasting by learners, getting speaking partners using programs like italki, Mingle, etc. AI bots, artificial intelligence bots, and language learning apps. There it is. I said I'd mention Duolingo. There it is. My hairdresser in Barcelona is an Algerian, and he speaks about 4 different languages, but he wants to learn English, and so he enrolled in some sort of very cheap language classes provided by the local authority. But at the same time, he was using Duolingo outside of the classroom, and he said between the two things, he felt supported in his attempt to learn English. So there you go, There are various quotes about you can read these at your leisure. Extensive reading, how good it is for not just reading skills, but learning vocabulary, listening, speaking abilities improve, writing improves the more students read. Problem is, if they don't read, if they're not in the habit of reading in their first language, how can we get them into the habit of reading in the second language? And Pato made a very good point in the forum. Well, actually, they do read. Actually, they might not read War and Peace or David Copperfield, but they read a lot of text messages. Word cards. I love these. These are little word cards that are made in China, but sold through the Japanese fashion outlet called Muji, and you can put them on a key ring. But of course, we're more familiar with the things like Quizlet. So this is, I've just borrowed from a friend of mine who's been learning Swedish for the last 2 or 3 years, and he keeps a record on Quizlet of all these, and he tests himself regularly and updates these lists. Notice it's not vocabulary so much as expressions that came up in his one-to-one conversations using italki with a Swedish speaker. WhatsApp. Now, this is a fabulous idea that a colleague of mine here, Jessica Mackay, has done with some colleagues in Barcelona. She's presented about this recently, where the students form WhatsApp groups, private WhatsApp groups, and there's various instructions and ways that they can maintain their privacy. Ensure that. I won't go into that, but she sets them tasks in these groups that they do outside the classroom, and it's voluntary. It's voluntary. But first of all, she teaches them various expressions, and there'll be a task. I'm going to write 2 things. You need to choose which one you prefer. Write the name of the thing you prefer and use one of the expressions from the list. So the 2 things are, for example, traveling by bus or traveling by train. And you can write, she gives an example, traveling by train, absolutely. If you don't like, she says, if you don't like traveling by bus or train, you don't like traveling, you can write neither, okay? Off they go. They do this. And here's an example of a student responses. Oscar. I guess that's better traveling by train because you can, et cetera, et cetera. That's the first round of the task. And then she says, okay, thank you. Now it's your turn. Think of 2 things that are different but related. The first person who's ready can post their 2 things. The next person responds, et cetera. So once they've got an example, they can then, so cats or dogs, pasta or pizza, and so on. And the amazing thing about this, when she demonstrated this at a conference I saw recently, was, and there's an article in ELT Journal. The students most of the students not only did these tasks, but they carried on communicating with each other outside the classroom in English using their groups, sending photos to each other, checking what they were doing in the vacation, etc., etc., etc. It started a kind of mini community. Fantastic opportunities, because it raises all sorts of questions. To what extent does the teacher correct the errors, collect errors, and maybe have a review session? All sorts of possibilities there. AI. Okay, so my Swedish learning friend again. Shall I give him a name? I'll give him a name. He's called Pete. He says to AI, ChatGPT, ask me about my weekend activities in Swedish. I'm level 1. Please correct me. So this is chat. He says, certainly. Ask them a question in Swedish. Pete responds in that bottom box there. And then ChatGPT says, great, your sentence is very understandable, close to great. Here's a corrected version with an explanation. I mean, this is amazing. And apparently the explanation is correct. And they carries on like that, the conversation, just using the bot. Yeah, again, I'm sure you're familiar with the possibilities here. Okay, and Mario Kreutzberger, the Chilean broadcaster, you can have a look at that. He was a self-taught learner in New York when he was 17, Spanish speaker, arrived in New York, no English, and he set about learning English using maximizing opportunities in the street, pre-WhatsApp, pre-AI, but just having conversations with people. So these are some of, it seems to me, some of the, and certainly not an exhausted list of the possibilities of maximizing learning opportunities, both in the classroom, but also outside the classroom, and then ideally bringing the two places together. So what learners are discovering, what they're reading about outside the classroom, the conversations they're having outside the classroom can feed into the content of the lessons themselves. Okay, bit of a rush. Anybody want to chip in there, add or clarify or ask for clarification? Jose, sorry, I keep calling you by your Catalan name.
No, that's okay. It works. I guess I'm the only one in the room that would probably respond to that. Well, of course, I'm not trying to find an answer to my dilemma here, because nowadays, as a retired professor, I do a lot of teacher training in different schools. You know, I don't have a lot of activities now, and then they found me and they asked me to go and train these novice teachers. And the dilemma for me is exactly that. I think that all of the things, especially now at the end that you showed, because when we talk about the principles, we're talking about tenets, but then we go from how to how. It goes from what are the procedures, what are the techniques, what are the strategies? Because I think all of us here, with the experience that we have, we can handle something like that. You know, we can relinquish control. We can, although we're relinquishing control, we still have the reins in our hands of how the class should go. But my question and dilemma, as I said, is could all these tenets be sort of summarized or packaged in ways that we could give novice teachers certain procedures and strategies and techniques? Because when I'm doing these training sessions, what happens is they ask me, okay, but how should I do this? Should I wait for the students to answer? So they want to see the steps of the whole procedure. So that's, I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. Maybe there isn't, and I'll just keep on doing what I'm doing. Yeah, but
I don't think there's easy answers, but okay, James. But those of you who are involved in pre-service training may have some suggestions there. Just hold it a second, Kata. Let me move over to you because you've got your hand up, and then we'll come back to Jose's question. Kata, are you going to say something?
Yes, okay. So my question relates to the extensive reading that you mentioned that we are going to discuss. So what would be your suggestion to avoid memorizing rules and forms, and just with the exposure of extensive reading and reading a lot? Can someone learn a language by reading enough? And just minimizing the time spent on form and accuracy in class.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I have a certain skepticism about some of the claims made for extensive reading. It's simply because I thought that when I moved to Spain, that by extensively reading newspapers, etc., my Spanish would improve. But I actually measured how much input I was getting at one point, or had over 30 years, in terms of the number of words per day, and then related that, was able to make a rough measure of my receptive vocabulary. And the correlation was kind of disappointing. What I should have had put into the theory and what I do have didn't match. That is to say, I seem to be not extending my vocabulary in the way that some theorists claim, some researchers claim. Now, why wasn't I? Well, partly perhaps because I wasn't paying attention to the words that I didn't know. I was just gliding over them. You know, there's all sorts of reasons. But I'm a little skeptical. I think the research suggests that to really get a benefit from extensive reading, you need to read about 2 million words a year, which may sound like a lot, actually over a year, it's not a lot. Your average novel is about 20, 30,000 words. So it would mean, reading a fair few novels or newspapers or whatever. But if you combine that with watching streamed videos with subtitles, etc., I mean, there's all sorts of other sources of reading other than novels, if we said. But I don't think, coming back to your point, that I'm not sure that you could learn a language simply by reading. You'd be a good reader of the language, but it wouldn't necessarily impact your production skills. Whatever Stephen Krashen says. But that's just my take. I'm not a good language learner, let's face it. Not like you. Let me just go back to José's question about training new teachers in things like relinquishing control, managing large classes, etc. It seems to me you don't talk about it, you just do it. So you do activities with them, and then you say, okay, so what can you remember how I set that activity? Can you remember the stages of the activity? Can you remember can you remember how you felt during the activity, etc., etc., etc. So, an activity-driven approach. And there's lots of activities that demonstrate some of these basic principles of triggering interest in a topic and putting learners into groups to generate statements about the topic or text about the topic, opinions about the topic, questions about the topic, and then feeding those back to the teacher, who then shapes them into grown-up language. And then summarizing, answering the questions, etc. There's techniques, activities that I think can demonstrate even to new teachers that, yes, you can hand over some of the agency, if you like, to the learners, as long as you keep a weather eye on them and are there to help them when they run out, or but I mean, again, my experience is that, and it may not be true, maybe a cultural thing, but certainly here in Spain and when I was teaching in Egypt, that once you put students into groups, there's no stopping them. It just runs and runs and runs. But I mean, no, it might not be the same in Japan. Where's Hugh? Hugh nodding. Famously Japan, yes. Anyway, yes. Anything else? Anybody wants to add?
Totally depends on the type of group.
Okay.
I mean, with my adult students, we have a Line group. So Line is like WhatsApp. It's a messaging app, and it's very social. So it's a totally different thing from the university.
Mm-hmm.
There, yeah, it just goes. But
really,
the institutional contexts are much narrower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it comes back to one of the criticisms. I mean, a lot of what I've been saying today, what we've all been saying, the elephant in the room, if you like, is dogma or teaching unplugged. Because I mean, so much of this is really about is fundamental to that approach. And of course, a lot of people would say or have said, yeah, but that's all very well. Dogma works in Spain, it works in Egypt, maybe, but it doesn't work in Japan. Well, I mean, testimony to the fact that it does work in Japan is the book that came out, ITDI's book on dogma in practice, that, many examples of lessons came from contexts like Japan, where, with a bit of massaging, the approach does seem to be possible. But basically, okay, Kanduk, inherent to that is this notion of giving learners more agency. But you can't give them agency overnight. You can't just say to learners, okay, you're on your own now.
I would like
Okay.
to give my
Yes.
experience on this. Well, this is my 4th year of teaching, but I remember that I had my CELTA the first year of teaching. Same thing for us as a novice teacher. We follow the structure, so we know how to do, like, okay, we're gonna do, for example, ELT method. We're gonna do this. But usually what trainers forget to say, or let's say forget to mention, is that you can actually sometimes give the whole class, give them some opportunity to talk more than the course book. And I believe that you need to help the students to dive into, let's say, I call language learning as the ocean. And I always say that you need to throw yourself in the water, otherwise you cannot learn. But apparently, on the first year, except teaching them how to swim, I drowned one of them. Just because I didn't know how to uh, control the class after that. And I never given them the opportunity to actually use their own language. So it was always based on the textbook, based on something. And I remember that person had a tough time in that moment, and somehow I drowned them at the end. And I think they left learning language completely. But that's just my memory as a novice teacher that I learned from that moment that you don't have to follow the context of the books. And just because they sometimes cannot handle it, they're not in the position or they're not emotionally prepared for that book. You have to just follow what they're into. Yeah.
And I mean, following up on your metaphor, Saba, you need to have a kind of lifesaver available, that you can throw in if they are drowning. And that may well be their first language. And you have permission, if you're unsure, even though I'm trying to encourage you to use the target language. But, please put your hand up and ask me in Farsi. Lifebelts, that's what I meant.
I would like to.
Just say.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I would like to add something related to what Saba just said. During the pandemic, after many years teaching freely, I decided to take the CELTA. And yeah, well, some of the tutors said, "Why are you taking it now?" They almost said, "You're reaching the end of your career. Why are you taking this now?" And then I thought, oh, CELTA is really going to help me systematize many things. And then I felt myself in a straitjacket. But then one of the tutors said something. He said, well, here you have to do this. Cambridge wants you to do this. Outside, you can do whatever you want. And I think it's not really doing whatever we want, but whatever we feel might be useful for language learning. But I think that's the balance I'm trying to find between the straitjacket and the opportunity to dive into language learning and language teaching, and that might take a while, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see no problem at all in a CELTA kind of approach and the constraints that go with CELTA, and it's designed for teachers with much less experience than you, obviously. But I think anybody who's teaching the CELTA should also add a kind of health warning to it and say, these are suggestions. This is not the answer. May not work when you go off to wherever you go to teach, and you need to be sensitive to the context and you need to be prepared to adapt. So don't take this as being the only way to teach. And that certainly when I did my pre-service training 500 years ago, I did think it was the only way to teach. And I was amazed. It took me some considerable time of teaching to realize that it had shortcomings. But I mean, unlike Saba, I wasn't aware of how many people had drowned because I was committed to the CELTA kind of approach. I may well have lost lots of students who didn't like that kind of communicative, no use of the first language, etc., etc. It took me ages to really think outside the box, and that's what we should always be doing all the time. And that's the thing why I'm nervous about, a principled approach. This is the way it should be done, kind of thing. Now, they're not saying that, but it does send a mixed message to me that these are the principles. And if you don't like them, I have others. We have to be very careful of not even if we do, our intention is not to be prescriptive, if our intention is not to be dogmatic, we still will come across as being prescriptive and dogmatic because we're the trainer. We're the ones in control. We are the masters. We're the ones who are giving them some kind of evaluation at the end of the course. Of course, they're going to try and do what we're telling them to do, or they want to believe that this is the only way to teach. So we need to be very cautious, as I say, put a health warning on these kinds of courses, on this course too, for that matter. On speaking of which, it's 1:30 here. Any last minute things that you're desperate to say? We're losing people. Let's call it a day. And chapter 5 for next week, I'll be posting tasks, etc. Please revisit the forums if you haven't looked for a while, see what wonderful things people have been saying and suggesting. And thank you yet again for a fascinating excursion into post-method methodology. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
See you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.